The courtroom was alive with its usual hum of activity as people shuffled in, finding their seats. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and old paper, a reminder of the countless cases that had been argued within these walls. Judge Harold Grayson entered with his typical air of authority, his black robe flowing behind him like a cape. He was a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper opinions. To many he was intimidating, a figure who commanded respect but rarely gave it. His reputation preceded him, quick to mock, slow to listen, and always eager to assert dominance over anyone who dared step into his courtroom. Today's case seemed unremarkable at first glance. It was a small claims dispute, the kind of thing that often got lost in the shuffle of more high-profile trials. On one side of the room sat the plaintiff, flanked by a slick, well-dressed attorney who looked ready to devour his opponent. Across the aisle stood Clara Bennett, a woman whose appearance couldn't have been more different. She wore a plain dress that looked like it had seen better days, her hair tied back in a simple bun. Her hands clasped tightly around a worn leather bag, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. If there was ever a picture of someone out of their depth, it was Clara. Judge Grayson barely glanced at her before leaning back in his chair, his expression already bored. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with impatience. "Let's get this over with." As the plaintiff's lawyer launched into an elaborate opening statement filled with complicated legal terms, Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Every now and then she would fidget or shift uncomfortably in her seat, drawing amused glances from the gallery. Some spectators whispered among themselves, clearly entertained by what they assumed would be a swift victory for the other side. But Judge Grayson wasn't content to simply let the proceedings unfold. No, he had to make his presence felt. When it came time for Clara to respond, he leaned forward slightly, his eyebrows raised in mock curiosity. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I assume you're prepared to defend yourself? Or are we wasting everyone's time here?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Clara didn't react. Instead, she nodded meekly, her voice barely audible as she mumbled something about being ready. This only encouraged the judge to press further. "You know," he continued, addressing the courtroom as much as Clara, "the law is a complex field, not exactly suited for amateurs, if you catch my drift." More laughter followed, though it was clear he wasn't joking. Clara's cheeks flushed red, but she kept her composure, her head bowed as if trying to disappear into herself. To the casual observer, it looked like Judge Grayson had won this round before the fight had even begun. What no one realized, not the judge, not the opposing counsel, not even the curious onlookers, was that Clara's demeanor was anything but accidental. Every movement, every stutter, every moment of hesitation had been carefully calculated. Beneath the surface of her timid exterior lay a mind sharper than most could imagine. Clara had spent weeks preparing for this day, studying every detail of the case, anticipating every possible argument the other side might throw at her, and yet she knew that winning wouldn't just come down to facts and logic. It would require something more subtle, a performance so convincing that it would disarm her opponents completely. As the trial progressed, Judge Grayson grew increasingly dismissive, treating Clara like little more than a nuisance. He interrupted her whenever she tried to speak, correcting her phrasing or outright mocking her attempts to articulate her points. At one point, he even turned to the jury with a smirk, saying, "Perhaps we should offer Ms. Bennett a crash course in legal procedure. Heaven knows she needs it." The comment drew more laughter, but there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of cruelty that made some in the room uneasy. Despite the mounting pressure, Clara stayed calm. Each insult, each condescending remark only strengthened her resolve. She watched silently as the opposing lawyer strutted around the courtroom, confident in his superiority. She noticed how Judge Grayson's smug expressions betrayed his belief that the outcome was already decided. And she waited, biding her time, knowing that the moment to strike would come soon enough. Unbeknownst to everyone, Clara's decision to appear as a simple woman was part of a larger plan. Years ago, she had been one of the brightest attorneys in the city, renowned for her ability to turn even the toughest cases in her favor. But the cutthroat nature of the legal world had left her disillusioned. She walked away from the profession, vowing never to return unless it was on her own terms. This case, however, presented an opportunity too perfect to pass up. By playing the role of an unassuming defendant, she hoped to expose the flaws in a system that often favored arrogance over justice, and to teach a lesson to those who underestimated the power of humility. For now, though, Clara remained silent, allowing Judge Grayson and the opposing counsel to revel in their perceived victory. They had no idea what was coming next, or that the tables were about to turn in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of anticipation and amusement as the plaintiff's attorney, confident in his superiority, launched into a theatrical opening statement. His voice boomed through the room, each word carefully chosen to impress the judge and intimidate Clara. He peppered his speech with complex legal terms, throwing around phrases like breach of covenant and tortious interference as if they were weapons designed to overwhelm. The opposing counsel paced back and forth, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor, his gestures exaggerated for dramatic effect. To anyone watching, it was clear he believed this case would be an easy win. After all, how could someone as unassuming as Clara possibly stand up to him? Clara, meanwhile, sat quietly at her table, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't interrupt or object, even when the lawyer made sweeping claims that seemed to stretch the truth. Her eyes remained downcast, occasionally darting toward the judge or the jury, but she gave no indication that she was planning anything. Spectators exchanged knowing glances, convinced that this mismatch was already decided. Some whispered bets about how quickly the verdict would come in favor of the plaintiff. Judge Grayson, too, leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. He nodded along with the lawyer's arguments, his expression smug, as if he were silently congratulating himself for predicting such an outcome. When it was finally Clara's turn to speak, the room fell eerily quiet. All eyes turned to her, waiting to see what this seemingly timid woman would do. For a moment she hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her worn leather bag. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. Her movements were deliberate but uncertain, as though she were unsure of herself. When she began to speak, her voice trembled slightly, barely audible over the faint rustling of papers in the background. "Your Honor," she stammered, pausing to clear her throat. I understand that I may not seem qualified to address this court." Her words hung in the air, heavy with self-doubt. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting nothing more than a feeble attempt to justify her presence. A few people in the gallery chuckled softly, their amusement palpable. Even the plaintiff's lawyer smirked, leaning casually against the railing as if he had all the time in the world to watch her stumble. But beneath Clara's apparent nervousness lay a mind working furiously. Every pause, every stutter, was part of a larger strategy. She knew exactly what she was doing, feeding into the narrative they had already created about her. Let them underestimate her, she thought. Let them believe she was harmless. With each condescending glance from the judge, and each dismissive gesture from the opposing counsel, she gathered ammunition for the battle ahead. And while the room focused on her supposed weakness, she quietly observed their mistakes, filing away every misstep for later use. Judge Grayson, however, couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. Leaning forward slightly, he fixed Clara with a patronizing smile. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his tone dripping with mockery, "perhaps you'd care to explain why we should take your claims seriously. Or are you simply here to waste our time?" The question drew scattered laughter from the crowd, and Clara flinched visibly, her cheeks flushing red. But instead of snapping back or showing anger, she lowered her head, pretending to be overwhelmed. I'm sorry, Your Honor," she murmured, her voice wavering. "I'll try my best." The judge rolled his eyes dramatically, turning to the jury with a theatrical sigh. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to make his point. "This is precisely why we have rules in place. Justice isn't served by amateurs playing lawyer. More laughter followed, and Clara's shoulders slumped as if defeated. Yet hidden behind her meek exterior was a simmering determination. Each insult only sharpened her focus, each barb reinforcing her resolve to prove them wrong. As the trial continued, the opposing counsel seized every opportunity to pile on. He interrupted Clara whenever she tried to speak, cutting her off mid-sentence with objections or corrections. "Your Honor," he interjected at one point, his tone dripping with disdain, "I must insist that Ms. Bennett refrain from making baseless assertions. This isn't amateur hour." The comment elicited chuckles from the gallery, but Judge Grayson merely waved a hand, signaling for Clara to continue. It was clear he expected her to crumble under the pressure, and why wouldn't he? Everything about her screamed vulnerability. What none of them realized was that Clara wasn't just enduring their verbal barrage. She was dissecting it. She listened intently to every word, identifying inconsistencies in the plaintiff's arguments and noting procedural errors made by both the lawyer and the judge. When the opposing counsel presented evidence, a stack of documents meant to support his claims, Clara tilted her head slightly, studying them with feigned confusion. Inside, her mind raced, piecing together connections and formulating counter-arguments. She waited patiently, letting them revel in their false sense of security. At one point, the plaintiff's lawyer handed a piece of paper to the judge, claiming it proved his client's damages. Clara glanced at it briefly, then looked away as if uninterested. In reality, she had already spotted something crucial, a discrepancy in the dates listed on the document. It was a minor detail, easily overlooked, but it would become pivotal later. For now, she kept her discovery to herself, allowing the lawyer to bask in his perceived triumph. Throughout it all, Judge Grayson remained oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Clara's calm exterior. He continued to mock her, peppering his remarks with thinly veiled insults. "Ms. Bennett," he said at one point, his lips curling into a sneer, "if you're struggling to keep up, perhaps you should consider hiring representation next time." The jab drew more laughter, but Clara simply nodded, her expression one of quiet acceptance. What he didn't know, and what no one else suspected, was that she was far ahead of him. Every snide remark, every condescending comment only strengthened her resolve to expose the truth. By the time the session drew to a close, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with condescension. The opposing counsel packed up his papers with a satisfied grin, certain that victory was within reach. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, looking as though he had already dismissed the case from his mind. The spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about how long it would take for the verdict to come in. Clara, meanwhile, returned to her seat, her head bowed as if in defeat. But as the gavel struck and the room began to empty, a small, almost imperceptible, smile flickered across Clara's face. She had played her part perfectly, luring them into a false sense of confidence. Now it was only a matter of time before she revealed the true extent of her brilliance, and turned the tables on everyone who had dared to underestimate her. The courtroom began to settle into its usual rhythm as the afternoon wore on. The plaintiff's attorney, still basking in his earlier dominance, leaned casually against the railing, radiating an air of smug confidence. Judge Grayson, too, seemed content to let the proceedings drift along, occasionally glancing at his watch as if eager for the day to end. Clara, meanwhile, remained seated quietly at her table, her head bowed and her hands resting lightly on her bag. To anyone watching, it appeared she was preparing to accept defeat, or perhaps simply waiting for the inevitable verdict that would seal her fate. But then, something unexpected happened. As the plaintiff's lawyer wrapped up his final argument, Clara suddenly straightened in her chair. Her movements were subtle but deliberate, catching the attention of a few curious onlookers. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her eyes lifting to meet Judge Grayson's. For the first time since the trial began, there was no trace of hesitation in her posture. Instead, she stood tall, her expression calm and composed. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that it drew a collective murmur from the gallery. "Your Honor," Clara began, her voice steady and clear, devoid of the tremor that had characterized her earlier attempts to speak. With your permission, I'd like to present evidence relevant to this case. She reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a stack of neatly organized documents. The contrast between her appearance and the precision with which she handled the papers was striking. Even Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, though his expression remained skeptical. The plaintiff's lawyer, sensing a potential threat, stepped forward quickly. "Objection, Your Honor," he exclaimed, his tone sharp and dismissive. "There's no indication these documents were disclosed during discovery. This is highly irregular." His words carried the weight of authority, designed to shut down whatever feeble attempt Clara might be making to salvage her case. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she turned toward the judge, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying just enough firmness to command attention. "These documents are public records, available through proper channels. They directly contradict the claims made by the plaintiff and are therefore admissible under Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence." A hush fell over the courtroom. Spectators exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Was this really the same woman who had stumbled over her words mere hours ago? Even Judge Grayson looked taken aback, though he quickly masked his surprise with a frown. "Proceed," he muttered reluctantly, waving a hand to indicate she should continue. Clara wasted no time. One by one, she presented the documents, each piece of evidence meticulously chosen to dismantle the opposing side's arguments. She pointed out discrepancies in the dates listed on the plaintiff's exhibits, highlighting how certain claims couldn't possibly align with the timeline provided. She cited obscure legal precedents, quoting verbatim from landmark cases that even seasoned attorneys struggled to remember. With every word, her confidence grew, and the room seemed to shrink around her as all eyes focused intently on her performance. The plaintiff's lawyer, once so self-assured, began to falter. He shifted uncomfortably, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of Clara's relentless logic. When he tried to interrupt or object, Clara countered with razor-sharp precision, citing statutes and procedural rules that left him scrambling for a response. "Your Honor," he stammered at one point, clearly flustered, "this is unprecedented. Surely we can't allow—" "Counsel," Judge Grayson interrupted sharply, his irritation evident. "Ms. Bennett has cited valid legal grounds. Unless you have a substantive rebuttal, I suggest you remain silent." The reprimand silenced the lawyer, who retreated to his seat, visibly shaken. As Clara pressed on, it became increasingly clear that she was not merely presenting evidence. She was orchestrating a masterclass in legal strategy. Each document, each citation, served a dual purpose: to refute the plaintiff's claims while simultaneously exposing the flaws in their case. But what truly stunned the courtroom was the depth of her knowledge. It wasn't just that she knew the law. It was that she understood it on a level few could match. Her arguments flowed seamlessly, connecting dots that others hadn't even noticed existed. Judge Grayson, who had spent much of the trial mocking Clara, now found himself struggling to keep up. He flipped through the documents she submitted, his brow furrowing as he realized the implications of her findings. At one point, he leaned forward slightly, studying a particular exhibit with growing unease. "Ms. Bennett," he said finally, his tone noticeably less condescending, "where did you say you obtained these records?" "They're publicly accessible, Your Honor," Clara replied smoothly, her voice betraying no hint of triumph. "I simply took the time to review them thoroughly. Perhaps others might benefit from doing the same." The remark drew murmurs of approval from the gallery, though it also elicited a glare from the plaintiff's lawyer, who now looked more embarrassed than angry. For the first time, doubt crept into the minds of those who had dismissed Clara as an amateur. Who was this woman really, and how had she managed to outmaneuver a seasoned attorney with such ease? By the time Clara concluded her presentation, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. What had started as a lopsided battle now felt like a reckoning. The jury sat upright, their expressions thoughtful, clearly impressed by the clarity and authority with which Clara had presented her case. Even Judge Grayson, who prided himself on maintaining control, seemed unsettled. He glanced repeatedly at the documents before him, as if searching for some flaw in her reasoning, but found none. When Clara finally returned to her seat, the room remained eerily quiet. The plaintiff's lawyer slumped in his chair, defeated, while Judge Grayson rubbed his temples, clearly grappling with the implications of what had just transpired. Clara, however, betrayed no emotion. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression serene, as if she had known all along how this moment would unfold. It was only after a long pause that Judge Grayson spoke again, his voice unusually subdued. "Ms. Bennett," he said, addressing her directly for the first time without sarcasm, "you've certainly given us much to consider. We'll recess briefly to review the evidence." With that, he struck the gavel, signaling a break in the proceedings. As the courtroom emptied, whispers erupted among the spectators. Some praised Clara's brilliance, while others speculated about her background. How had someone so unassuming managed to outwit everyone in the room? The plaintiff's lawyer hurried out, avoiding eye contact with anyone, while Judge Grayson retreated to his chambers, his usual arrogance replaced by a rare sense of humility. For Clara, the moment was bittersweet. She had achieved exactly what she set out to do, expose the arrogance and complacency that often plagued the legal system. Yet she knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more battles ahead, both in this courtroom and beyond. But for now, she allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction. She had proven her point and reminded everyone present that intelligence and integrity could triumph over prejudice and hubris. When the courtroom reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The earlier mockery and dismissive attitudes were replaced by an undercurrent of tension and uncertainty. Judge Grayson re-entered the room with a more measured demeanor, his usual swagger noticeably absent. He avoided making eye contact with Clara as he took his seat, focusing instead on the stack of documents she had presented. The plaintiff's attorney sat stiffly at his table, his confidence shattered, while the jury exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions reflecting newfound respect for the woman who had turned the trial on its head. Clara, meanwhile, remained composed, her calm exterior betraying none of the satisfaction she must have felt. As the proceedings resumed, Judge Grayson cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his tone unusually formal, "you've raised several compelling points that warrant further examination. However, I must also address certain procedural concerns that have arisen during this hearing. It was a calculated an attempt to regain control of the narrative." But Clara was ready. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and faced the judge with unwavering poise. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I appreciate your diligence in ensuring fairness. However, if we are discussing procedural concerns, it's important to note that some irregularities predate my presentation of evidence." Her words hung in the air, sharp and pointed, as all eyes turned to Judge Grayson. The judge froze momentarily, caught off guard by her directness. Clara didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, she continued, her tone respectful but firm. "For instance, Your Honor, there were multiple instances where objections were sustained without proper justification, potentially prejudicing the jury against my case. Additionally, comments made during the trial, both by yourself and opposing counsel, could be construed as biased and inflammatory." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Spectators leaned forward, intrigued by the boldness of her statement. Judge Grayson's face reddened slightly, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Ms. Bennett," he interjected, his voice tinged with irritation, "are you suggesting that this court has acted improperly?" Clara met his gaze squarely. "Not at all, Your Honor. I am merely pointing out areas where adherence to protocol may have been overlooked. If we value justice, it's essential to acknowledge these lapses and ensure they don't influence the outcome of this case, or any other." Her response was masterful, a blend of diplomacy and assertion that left no room for argument. Even, the plaintiff's attorney seemed to shrink into his chair, realizing that any attempt to defend himself would only dig a deeper hole. "Judge, not clear," The courtroom was eerily silent as Clara's words echoed in the air, each syllable landing with precision. Judge Grayson sat frozen for a moment, his usual bravado replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. He glanced at the jury, then at the gallery, as if searching for some sign of support, or perhaps a distraction. But there was none. Every person in the room seemed captivated by the unfolding drama, their eyes fixed on Clara, who stood calmly at her table, her expression serene yet resolute. Finally, Judge Grayson cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Bennett," he began, his voice measured but tinged with unease, "you've raised valid concerns. However, it is also important to remember that this court operates within established guidelines. Any perceived lapses can be addressed after the fact, not during proceedings." It was a weak attempt to regain control, but Clara didn't let him off the hook so easily. "Your Honor," she replied, her tone respectful but unyielding, "I understand the importance of maintaining order, but justice isn't just about following rules, it's about ensuring fairness. And when those rules are bent or ignored, even unintentionally, it undermines the integrity of the entire process." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "If we truly seek justice, we must hold ourselves accountable, not only as individuals but as institutions." Her statement struck a chord. The jurors exchanged glances, nodding almost imperceptibly. Even the court reporter looked up briefly, her pen hovering over the page as if she, too, recognized the gravity of what was being said. Judge Grayson shifted, uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a rare vulnerability. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning whether he had crossed a line, not just today, but in countless other cases where his sharp tongue and dismissive attitude had gone unchecked. Clara pressed on, turning her attention to the plaintiff's attorney. "As for opposing counsel," she said, gesturing toward the man who now looked like a cornered animal, "his conduct throughout this trial has been equally concerning. From making unfounded assumptions about my abilities to presenting evidence that lacks credibility, his actions have done more harm than good. This isn't just about winning or losing. It's about respecting the principles upon which our legal system is built." The lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, he sank deeper into his chair, his polished exterior crumbling under the weight of Clara's critique. The spectators whispered among themselves, their earlier amusement replaced by admiration for the woman who had taken on two powerful figures and emerged victorious. Some even nodded approvingly, clearly moved by her defense of fairness and accountability. Judge Grayson, sensing the tide had turned against him, decided to take a different approach. Leaning back in his chair, he folded his hands and regarded Clara with something resembling respect. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone softer now, "it seems you've given us all much to reflect on. While I may not agree with everything you've said, I cannot deny the validity of your arguments. Perhaps this case will serve as a reminder, to myself included, that humility and diligence are essential in the pursuit of justice." His admission sent ripples through the courtroom. Never before had anyone witnessed Judge Grayson acknowledge fault, let alone in such a public manner. The gallery erupted in murmurs, though they quickly quieted down as the judge raised a hand to restore order. "Let us proceed," he continued, addressing the jury directly. "You've heard the evidence presented by both sides. It is now your duty to weigh it carefully and render a verdict based solely on the facts, not personal biases or external pressures." With that, the trial moved into its final phase. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the rest of the courtroom to wait anxiously for their decision. During this time, Clara remained seated quietly at her table, her posture relaxed but alert. Opposite her, the plaintiff's attorney paced nervously, occasionally casting furtive glances in her direction. Judge Grayson retreated to his chambers, his expression unreadable but undeniably troubled. Outside the courtroom, news of the dramatic turn of events spread like wildfire. Reporters gathered in the hallway, eager to interview anyone willing to share details about the extraordinary trial. Spectators spilled out into the corridors, buzzing with excitement as they discussed Clara's performance. Some hailed her as A hero, while others speculated about her background, wondering how someone so unassuming could possess such brilliance. Rumors swirled that she might be a retired attorney or a legal prodigy in disguise, though no one knew for sure. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood and addressed the judge, reading the verdict aloud. "We find in favor of the defendant, Ms. Clara Bennett." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a smattering of applause. Clara remained composed, offering a small nod to the jury, as if to thank them for their diligence. The plaintiff's attorney slumped visibly in defeat, while Judge Grayson banged his gavel to restore order, though his heart didn't seem to be in it. After dismissing the court, Judge Grayson lingered behind, signaling for Clara to approach the bench. When she did, he studied her intently, his expression a mix of curiosity and regret. "Ms. Bennett," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. You've reminded me of truths I thought I already knew, about fairness, humility, and the responsibility we bear as stewards of justice. I hope you'll forgive my earlier behavior." Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied softly. "Apologies aren't necessary. What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and strive to do better moving forward. That's the true measure of growth." Her words resonated deeply with the judge, who nodded solemnly before retreating to his chambers. As Clara gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, reporters swarmed around her, peppering her with questions. "Who are you really?" one asked. "Are you a lawyer? Why did you choose to represent yourself?" Clara smiled faintly, brushing off their inquiries with graceful evasiveness. "I'm just someone who believes in standing up for what's right," she said simply. "Sometimes that means taking risks and trusting that truth will prevail." With that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But her impact lingered long after she was gone. News outlets dubbed her the genius in disguise, recounting her remarkable victory in vivid detail. Legal professionals debated the implications of her strategy, marveling at her ability to expose flaws in the system while maintaining unwavering integrity. And Judge Grayson? He became a changed man, vowing to approach every case with renewed humility and respect, a lesson he owed entirely to the woman who had dared to challenge him. In the days that followed, Clara avoided the spotlight, declining interviews and offers from prestigious law firms eager to recruit her. Instead, she focused on her original mission, using her skills to help those who couldn't fight for themselves. She founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing affordable legal representation to marginalized communities, ensuring that justice remained accessible to everyone, not just those with resources or connections. As for Judge Grayson, he began mentoring young attorneys, emphasizing the importance of fairness, empathy, and accountability. Though his reputation had taken a hit, he embraced the opportunity to grow, viewing it as a chance to redeem himself in the eyes of the public, and more importantly, in his own heart. And so, the story of Clara Bennett came full circle, a tale of courage, intellect, and resilience that left an indelible mark on everyone involved. It was a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that humility often masks greatness, and that sometimes the simplest acts of defiance can spark profound change. In the weeks that followed the trial, Clara Bennett's name became synonymous with brilliance and integrity. News outlets couldn't get enough of her story, how a seemingly ordinary woman had walked into a courtroom, dismantled an arrogant opponent, and exposed the flaws in a system many thought was infallible. Social media buzzed with admiration for the genius in disguise, as people shared videos of her performance and debated what motivated her to take on such a challenge. Some speculated that she was a retired attorney seeking revenge against a biased system. Others believed she was simply a principled individual who saw injustice and decided to act. Whatever the truth, Clara remained enigmatic, refusing interviews or public appearances despite the growing demand for her insight. The plaintiff's attorney, whose career had taken a significant hit after his humiliating defeat, retreated from the spotlight entirely. Rumors circulated that he had been reprimanded by his firm, and might even lose his license over the questionable evidence he presented during the trial. While some sympathized with his predicament, most agreed that he had brought it upon himself through his arrogance and lack of preparation. The case served as a cautionary tale for lawyers everywhere. Never underestimate your opponent, no matter how unassuming they may seem. Judge Harold Grayson, too, underwent a transformation that few could have predicted. Known for years as a sharp-tongued jurist who ruled with an iron fist, he now approached every case with a newfound sense of humility. He attended workshops on judicial ethics, sought feedback from colleagues, and made a conscious effort to listen more than he spoke. His courtroom demeanor softened significantly. He stopped making snide remarks and began treating litigants, regardless of their background, with the respect they deserved. Though his reputation had suffered a blow, many came to admire him for owning up to his mistakes and striving to improve. For Clara, however, life returned to a quieter rhythm. She declined lucrative offers from top law firms eager to capitalize on her newfound fame. Instead, she poured her energy into building the nonprofit organization she had envisioned long before the trial. Named Equal Justice Initiative, not to be confused with the existing organization of a similar name. The group aimed to provide affordable legal representation to low-income individuals and marginalized communities. It wasn't just about offering free services. It was about empowering people to navigate the legal system with confidence and dignity. Clara worked tirelessly, recruiting a team of passionate attorneys and paralegals who shared her vision. Together, they tackled cases ranging from housing disputes to employment discrimination, ensuring that justice was accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford it. Her approach was unique. Rather than simply representing clients, she taught them how to advocate for themselves, equipping them with knowledge and tools they could use beyond the courtroom. Many of her clients described her as a mentor as much as a lawyer, a guiding light in moments of darkness. Word of Clara's work spread quickly, drawing support from unexpected quarters. Former adversaries, including Judge Grayson, reached out to offer their assistance. The judge, inspired by Clara's commitment to fairness, began referring pro bono cases to her organization and speaking at events to raise awareness about systemic inequities in the legal system. Even the plaintiff's attorney, humbled by his experience, volunteered his expertise occasionally, though he rarely stayed long enough to face Clara directly. Each contribution, big or small, helped strengthen the foundation Clara had built as Saint. Months turned into years. Clara's influence extended far beyond the courtroom. She wrote articles and gave occasional lectures at universities, sharing her insights on reforming the legal profession to make it more inclusive and compassionate. Her talks were always packed, not because she delivered dramatic speeches, but because she spoke with authenticity and wisdom. Students and professionals alike left her sessions inspired to rethink their roles within the justice system, to see themselves not merely as practitioners of the law, but as guardians of its moral compass. Despite her success, Clara remained grounded. She lived modestly, eschewing the trappings of wealth and status that often accompanied high-profile careers. To her, the true measure of achievement wasn't recognition or accolades. It was the difference she made in people's lives. Every client she helped, every student she mentored, every policy change she influenced was a victory worth celebrating. One evening, several years after the trial, Clara found herself sitting on a park bench overlooking the city skyline. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in hues of orange and pink. Beside her sat a young woman named Maya, one of the first clients she had represented through her nonprofit. Maya had been embroiled in a custody battle when Clara stepped in, helping her secure full rights to care for her child. Since then, Maya had rebuilt her life, finding stability and purpose, and she often visited Clara to express her gratitude. "You've changed so many lives," Maya said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I don't think you realize how much good you've done." Clara smiled faintly, shaking her head. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about creating a world where people like you don't need someone like me to fight for them, where the system works for everyone, not just a privileged few." Maya nodded thoughtfully, gazing out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. Well, whatever your reasons, I'm glad you're here. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. They sat in silence for a while, longer, watching as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. For Clara, this moment encapsulated everything she had worked toward, not fame or fortune, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. Somewhere along the way, she had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that courage and conviction could overcome even the most daunting odds. Unbeknownst to Clara, another figure watched from afar, Judge Grayson. He stood near a lamppost observing her interaction with Maya. Over the years, he had kept tabs on her progress, marveling at the ripple effect of her actions. Though they hadn't spoken since the trial, he felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her, not just for exposing his flaws, but for inspiring him to become a better version of himself. As he turned to leave, he whispered under his breath, "Thank you, Ms. Bennett." And so Clara's journey continued, a testament to the power of humility, resilience, and unwavering belief in justice. She had proven that greatness doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as something ordinary. But when given the chance, it can transform lives and systems in ways no one ever expects.